This greatest income over feed cost involves feed conversion, but also the growth rate of the waste from that feed. So the third one, greatest income over feed cost, is actually the one that considers all of the effects of feeding a fish. So for the purpose of this presentation only, we need to talk about a particular fish so that people don't get confused and they don't see a number for a feed conversion and sit there thinking this is too low or too high or something. So I've selected just randomly to use as an example the tilapia. And in the presentation I'm going to give, we're going to think about stocking those tilapia fingerlings when they're 50 grams and growing them up to 500 gram average weight. And again, for the purpose of this presentation, we're only going to talk about intensive culture conditions. So that would be intensively stocked ponds, intensively stocked cages, or in the case of the newest technology now, raceways, where they're in-pond raceway systems. We're also going to use, and did use in these tests, a 90% satiation feeding technique so that the fish are not getting all they want to eat every day. They're always just a little bit hungry. They could eat a little more feed, but we're not going to give it to them. And the last thing we're going to make the assumption is that there are no water quality issues. There are other things that go on in there that are going to affect feed conversion and mortalities and all that. But we're going to assume for the purposes of this discussion that water quality is perfect. So let's talk about the first one. That's the lowest cost feed. When you go out and buy the cheapest feed that you can find, what you end up with is a feed that has relatively high fiber, because that's the cheapest nutrient, or non-nutrient in this case, that we can put into the feed. Also, it's the lowest protein feed. Protein costs money. The more protein you put in there, the more expensive the feed is going to be. And finally, it has low digestible energy. Between the high fiber levels and using low fat levels and that sort of thing, the energy level is low. Now, I'm not going to say that a low-cost feed cannot be balanced. In fact, it needs to be balanced, otherwise you'll have other problems. But in a balanced, well-formulated, low-cost feed, you're going to get an increased feed conversion ratio. It's like driving your car and pushing your foot on the accelerator. The more gas you give it, the faster it's going to go. And so here we're talking about not giving that car very much gas, so it's going to grow slow and it's going to get a high conversion of feed to fish. The next concept is the lowest cost per kilogram of gain. And as I told you before, this involves not only the feed cost, but also the feed conversion. And finally, we're going to talk about the lowest cost per kilogram of gain. So in this slide, then, what I did, and it's theoretical. These are not fish that are fed. This is strictly a nutrition exercise. But I formulated 5 diets from a high of 44% protein, which no one's going to buy that for their fish, down to a low of 28% protein, which is a fairly common low protein level feed to see in the marketplace. The fat levels in these diets had to vary in order to maintain a consistent digestible energy to digestible protein ratio. I'm sorry, but the pointer just doesn't, it does show up here, but it won't show up on there. So I'll have to say, if you'll follow the line that says DE to DP ratio, you'll see that all of them are approximately 8.2 to 8.4 kilocalories of digestible energy per gram of protein. And that has to be maintained through the exercise, because if you don't, you'll have some energy either going to fat, and in other diets that energy is going to protein, and it throws things off balance for the fish. I used a theoretical estimator of feed conversion ratio, which nutritionists know that it takes about 4,080 kilocalories of digestible energy to gain 1 kilo of gain. So to calculate what's the theoretical conversion, you divide the digestible energy number into 4,080 kilocalories, and that gives you the estimated FCR. And I've done this a million times, and that procedure is very, very close to the actual values that you obtain. So then if you look at the ingredient cost of each of these feeds, the 44% protein diet obviously has the highest cost, and this is in US dollars per metric ton. You'll see that that highest protein feed costs $656.41 per ton. By the time you get down to the 28% protein diet, it's only $404.25 per ton. And so for most farmers, the tendency is to go for the low-cost feed. Buy that one that's only $404. That's got to be the best buy. But then when you take a look at what the ingredient cost is per kilo of gain and using that theoretical conversion, suddenly you notice that the FCR of the 28% protein feed is higher than the 32, which is higher or approximately the same as the 36% protein feed. Then all of a sudden, the 40% protein starts going up again. So what's happening is at very high protein levels, you have to buy expensive, high protein ingredients. And suddenly it becomes too expensive to get the nutrients that you want in a balanced formula. On the other end of the equation, the price starts going down, sure enough. What happens is the FCR goes up so much that suddenly the price per kilo of gain now is climbing all the time. That's not the only thing to consider. Manufacturing costs are a big part of the final sales price of the feed. And when you're looking at how a feed miller comes up with his final price, he has to add manufacturing cost as well as profit and transportation and all those other costs. But his manufacturing costs fall into two categories: variable feed costs, for instance, ingredients, shrinkage, and the profit that he adds. So the higher the cost of the ingredients, those things then impact the final manufacturing cost. But then the second group of costs are fixed. It costs the same amount of money pellet a 28% protein diet as it does to pellet a 44% protein diet. The numbers are identical. The packaging is identical. So it doesn't matter whether you buy one bag and put 28% protein feed in there or one bag and put 44% protein in there. Bag cost is the same. And then delivering and handling, maybe it'd be more accurate to call that a semi-variable cost. But it's if you have a set distance from the mill, for instance, let's say it's 20 kilometers from the mill, everybody that's within 20 kilometers of the mill is going to pay the same fixed delivery cost. So these variable, the profit on a high protein feed is higher and the profit on a low protein feed is lower. Adding up all those numbers, the actual feed cost, freight on board, FOB, at the mill runs from $846.52 down to only $547.84. And again, most farmers are going to look at that and say, give me that $547 one because that's less money. But then when you look at the estimated feed conversion and multiply that to obtain the feed cost per kilo of gain, suddenly you notice that the 44% protein feed costs $1.02 per kilo of gain. Going to 40% drops it to 97. Going to 36 drops it to 95. And then you think, okay, we're getting somewhere. I want to keep lowering my my protein level. So at 32, there's only 2 decimal places here, so it looks like it's the same number. But if you carried it out 4 decimal places, you'd see that the 32% protein continues. The cost per kilo of gain continues to go down ever so slightly, but when rounded to 2 decimal points, it's the same. But then when you get to the 28, suddenly the price is going up. And why is it doing that? It's because those 2 fixed costs, the bags and the milling cost, start to raise the price of that feed. Milling cost is starting to cost you more and more and more of the total sales price of the feed. Then when we add delivery cost, which is another fixed cost, it continues to slip away from you so that the 44 is still the highest, 40% protein is next highest, 36 is very close but still the next highest, and then the 32 comes out at 0.9663, and that's the lowest feed cost per kilo of gain, because then when you get to the 28%, suddenly the price jumps back up to $1. So those numbers don't seem like much on the face of it, but when you're feeding thousands of tons of feed, it starts making a big difference. Now let's go to the final evaluation of what's the best cost-effective feed. And this is the greatest income over feed cost. And you can see from the slide, again, feed cost is important. It's the basis for this calculation. Feed conversion, then, you multiply that by the feed cost to get cost per kilo of gain. But then you throw into the equation growth rate. How fast are they growing? If they grow faster in the same amount of pond space or raceway or cage, that means you can spread your production costs out over more tons of fish, reducing your production cost of fish. Body conformation may not be that important right now in India because there's not very much processing of aquaculture species. But once you throw the processing recovery numbers into this equation, you start looking at what's the feed cost per kilogram of edible portion of the fish. And then finally, in the lower left-hand side of this slide, I've got a picture of a guy in China using a high-pressure hose to wash the fish manure down and into the waterways. Low-protein feeds create a lot of waste, and what do you do with that waste? You have to get it out of the pond at the end of the crop in some way. And this final slide is from Dr. Mike Creamer, where he illustrates this example of how the waste continues to build with lower protein, lower energy feeds. So if you look at this table, you can see I've got 3 different feed conversion ratios. 1-to-1, which we'd all love to have that, but that seldom happens. 2-to-1, that happens a lot of times to farmers. And 3-to-1 feed conversion, meaning 3 kilos of feed per kilo of gain, that's a disaster. You hope you never get to a number that's that high. But on this slide, what I'm showing is the production of 1,000 kilograms of fish, live fish. And so you have to remember that in each kilogram of fish, 80% of that is water. So 800 grams of it is going to be water, and 200 grams is going to be fish. So when I feed 1 kilo, a feed is the opposite. It's 90% dry matter and only 10% moisture. As you get a higher and higher feed conversion, in the first example of 1-to-1 FCR, 1,000 kilos of feed, to get that 1-to-1 ratio, contains 90% dry matter, which is 900 kilos of dry matter in the feed. And that's at a 1-to-1 ratio. Since the fish is only 20% dry matter, it's going to equate to 200 kilos of dry matter fish. What happened to the rest of that 700 grams? That went into the water as waste. Now let's try the 2-to-1 ratio. So now we're going to have to feed 2,000 kilos of feed to get 1,000 kilos of fish. But of that 2,000 kilos of feed, since only 90% is dry matter, you've got 1,800 kilos of dry matter and 200 kilos of dry weight of fish. So now I've got 1,600 kilos of waste. And in the final one, you can do the math there. You see that it goes up over 2,500 kilos when you get a 3-to-1 FCR. So we can't sustain our fishery, we can't reuse our water. Everything becomes extremely unworkable as the FCR gets higher and higher and higher. So this is the theoretical part of the discussion. Most of the farmers are probably now asleep, but the next one I want to show you is where the U.S. Soybean Export Council then went into Haikou, China, and set up a demonstration for the local farmers. This has been several years ago. I think it was 2009. In Haikou, Hainan Island, U.S. Soybean Export Council set up a demonstration with a range of proteins that, for that area, the common approach by the farmer was to use a 24% protein feed. So we set that as our lowest limit, and then I formulated feeds at 28%, 32%, and 36% protein. 4% protein jumps for each one to show them what happens when you feed these different protein levels. On every slide here, look at the bottom part of the slide. That's the English portion, unless you're quite proficient at Mandarin Chinese. So these cages, they were 4 cubic meter cages, and each one was stocked with 1,200 fish. The term of the experiment was between 110 and 144 days. Those fish were originally stocked at 50 grams average weight. And the reason for the difference in the days is because we targeted the harvest weight to be 500 grams. So as soon as each cage got to 500 grams, we stopped, took them out and weighed them. And from that data, we calculated the days of growth and the FCR and survival and all of that stuff. And these diets then were in these 4 different protein levels. So here's the breakdown of the feed. The first one was a 36 protein level with 7% fat, a digestible energy of 2,837 kilocalories per kilogram, and a digestible energy to digestible protein of 8.4. The next one was a 32% protein diet with 6% fat, and its DE to DP ratio was very close to the same at 8.5 to 1. A 28% protein feed with 4% fat and an 8.5 to 1 DE to DP ratio. And finally, at the then popular 24% protein at 3.5% fat, again maintaining the DE to DP ratio at about 8.4, 8.5 to 1. On this slide, you'll notice that the first line is the number of feeding days. So that's determined by, from the day we stocked them, as soon as they hit 500 grams or very close to it, we terminated the cage and took the weights. So in the first example of 36.7, we took them out at 521 grams. We missed the target by 21 grams, but that's because the average weight gain per day was 4.28 grams per day. So every fish in there was gaining more than 4 grams a day. And by the time we noticed that they'd hit 500 grams, 4 days went by, and we ended up at 520 grams. So it's about as close as you could get trying to harvest them at 500 grams. The FCR on those fish was 1.25. In the 32% protein feed, again, we pulled them out at 110 days because they were 512 grams, very close to our 500 gram target size. They gained 4.2 grams per day. Survival was very good. FCR a little bit higher because, again, it's a little lower protein, lower fat, same DE to DP ratio, but less total energy. So we got a 1.37. In the 28% protein feed, which I understand here in India is fairly popular level of protein for tilapia and some of the carps, note that it took 127 days. It took us an extra 17 days to get to 500 grams. Fish gained 3.63 grams per day over the term of the experiment, and they had a feed conversion ratio of 1.55. And 1.55 is not a terrible number. It's not bad, but still it's higher than the other two. And finally, in this diet that was popular at the time on Hainan Island, 24% protein feed took 150 days to get to the target harvest weight. They gained 3 grams a day, which is not bad. That's pretty good. But they got a 1.74 FCR. Here's that illustrated graphically. The 36 and 32% protein feeds actually delivered the target size fish 40 days earlier than the lowest protein feed of 24%. And that 40 days, that's an important amount of time. You're putting in extra labor. You could produce more crops per year if you cut 40 days off of each crop. So this is where this greatest income over feed cost is starting to come into play. So then if we look at the feed cost per kilogram, this is in RMB per kilo, so don't worry about the number so much as the magnitude of the number. The 36% feed costs 5.85 RMB per kilo, I think, yes. And then the 32 is 5.05. The 28, of course, is cheaper at 4.55 RMB per kilo. And finally, no surprise, the 24% protein feed was only 4.15. But then when you look at the feed cost per kilo of gain, the 24% protein feed is almost as high in cost as the 36% protein feed. And only the 32 and 28 had the lower feed costs. And then when you look at what the net income per cage was, suddenly that's where all of this comes together. The FCR, the growth rate, and the feed cost itself. So the 36% protein feed yielded 239 RMB per cubic meter of cage. The 32% protein feed actually had 255 RMB per kilo. It has the highest income of the 4 diets that are shown here. The 28%, which is popular here right now, only 90.9, and the 24 came in dead last at only 63 RMB per cubic meter. So as a farmer, which one you gonna pick? You want to make as much money as you can, and that, in this case, in that day and time, was the 32.6 diet. So the conclusions for this are that in this low volume, high density culture of tilapia, we successfully and satisfactorily finished the experiment, even though there was a typhoon in the area. That was the biggest one they had had in 50 years. So we had a little bit lower survival than normal, but still those survivals, if you remember, didn't go below 90%. So the storm didn't cause that much trouble. The tilapia reached their target market size at over 510 grams in 110 days on the 36 and 32% protein extruded soy-based diets. The tilapia fed the 28 and 24% feeds required 17 and 30 days more respectively. The culture time to market, weight gain per day, FCR, and mortality rate, and farmer risk, that's something I didn't mention, but the farmer risk all increased with decreasing protein. And finally, the daily weight gain on the tilapia fed the 28 and 24% protein feeds were 15.7 and 36.8% lower than the 32% feed. Lowest FCR was from the 36, and all of this was done in 2009. What I see now is that at different years, because of the commodity prices, there can be a bit of a shift from one side to the other of what's the most optimum diet. Almost never have I seen it vary too far from 32%. It might go up to 34% in one year and down to 30% in another year, depending upon the relative cost of feed ingredients. But you never see it go up, for tilapia anyway, you never see it go up into the 40% range. And also, you can't make any money at those really low protein level feeds. So if there's a takeaway message that I'd like to convey to the farmers, and I hope those slides showed you that, it's that you really don't want to focus only on how much per ton does that feed cost. You want to look at all the other aspects of FCR, growth rate, body conformation, and the all-important turnover rate of those ponds. That concludes my presentation.